There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of domestic violence, murder, and suicide. Listener discretion is advised.
It's October 24, 1997, and 25-year-old Anu Singh, a promising young law student, invites friends over for a dinner party. She lives in a Canberra townhouse with her 26-year-old boyfriend, Joe Cinque. The pair met 2 years prior during a night out in Queensland. He was said to be immediately taken by Singh, and they quickly became inseparable. But something wasn't right about this dinner party. Friends who attended had heard of Singh's plans. She'd called the night a farewell, but some didn't take her remarks seriously. Singh had issued a warning before they arrived. Tonight, in her words, a crime was going to be committed. Her friends arrived at the Canberra townhouse and enjoyed the company of both Singh and Cinque. They drank and ate and eventually left to go home. It's what happened next, when the couple were alone, that has become something of a modern horror story. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. And this month, we've been looking specifically at women who kill. In today's episode, I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Greg Rance, who was part of the investigation into Joe Cinque's death. What do we know about what their relationship was like in those early days? Did people around them seem to think it was a healthy, normal relationship?
From all accounts, it was a pretty good relationship. There didn't seem to be any upheavals in the relationship, so to speak. They seemed to get on well together. The only issues that arose later on was that Anu believed that she was bulimic, and Joe had told her to look at Ipecac to control it, because she believed she was overweight, I should say. And she went on the idea that because of the Ipecac and what it was making her feel, that it was Joe's fault. So that was when they started moving away from each other.
And is that a drug that he allegedly sort of recommended her?
It was something that I believe that she got across the counter. So it wasn't anything that they had to go out hunting for. It wasn't an illegal drug. It was one that she could get across the counter.
And what do we know about Anu's childhood? Because as a young adult, it seems like there were some mental health issues. In terms of her upbringing and what her life was like, what do we know?
We never really delved too much into the background, and we left that for the psychiatrists, of course, and the psychologists during the trial. Both her parents were doctors, and her upbringing was not a bad upbringing, but as you say, there was indications that was brought out before the court that she did have some sort of issues, depression, etc., and that was dealt with by the father, who was a doctor. So it would appear that her upbringing was quite normal. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary with it, and that she was a very smart and intelligent young lady when she was going through school. So she was always well liked in the school area, and yeah, that was predominantly what we knew about her upbringing.
And leading up to October 25, 1997, had their relationship changed much? You mentioned that Joe allegedly recommended this drug that he thought might help. Had friends noticed tension or conflict arising between them?
No, and in fact, when these parties were going on that we could talk about a bit later, but when the people were invited round to the house, it seemed like a loving relationship between the two of them. There didn't appear to be anything outward about it, and this was something that was brought up at trial rather than early on in the conversations that we'd had with her.
And how did friends and family describe Joe? What kind of young man was he?
From all intents and purposes, he was a nice young fella that was straight up and down, good worker, attended his workplace. He was an intelligent young man.
What happened on that first dinner party? I believe it was October the 24th, and they attended a close friend's house. What happened?
Well, what it was there was another person involved in this scheme besides Anu Singh, and that was Madhavi Rao. Madhavi Rao, from all perceptions, she was a person who doggedly followed Anu Singh. So whatever Anu said, Madhavi Rao would do. So there was a fair bit leading up to this party itself. Anu Singh and Madhavi had gone to the Australian National University's library and looked at ways of how you would harm a person through the injection of heroin or Rohypnol or other drugs. Anu had already gone out and tried to get a weapon, a gun, from a person, and that wasn't successful. She'd then gone out and tried heroin herself. She'd never had heroin before, according to her, but she went out and bought some heroin and tried it herself on how to inject it. So she was shown how to inject it by a person. So then the scheme was brought up to have a party. And my belief is that Madhavi Rao knew what was going to happen at the party, that she was the one who actually invited all the guests to the party. Madhavi told them that the party was about a suicide pact by Anu Singh and Joe Cinque. They were all from the university, so they all turned up to the first party.
Do you think that Madhavi honestly thought it was a suicide pact or had more of an understanding of what Anu was planning on doing?
Myself and other investigators thought that she did know what was going to happen, that she knew that Anu wasn't going to kill herself, that it was only going to be Joe that was going to do it. Health Commission, where she told a co-worker there that on the night of the party, that they were going to have a party that night on the Friday night, and that at that party the biggest crime in the crime book would be committed. One can only assume that the biggest crime in the crime book, of course, is murder. So that person gave evidence to that effect at the court.
And so that Friday night, did Anu try to drug Joe, and what was Anu planning on using?
So she drugged him first with Rohypnol. That was in his coffee. That was the allegation. And then she attempted to inject him when he was asleep with the heroin, but the heroin jellied up, so she couldn't inject it into him. So she failed in her first attempt.
Did Joe have any idea?
No, Joe was in a stupor that first time, and the second time he went over many, many hours with the Rohypnol, and in fact, the second time he contacted a friend of theirs and spoke to that friend, this is Lenny Mancini, and said that he wasn't feeling very well. Anu Singh and Madhavi Rao actually went to see Lenny and told him that they'd given Joe the drug the previous evening. So these people were aware of it. This is out of the court, of course. So Lenny was aware of it. Joe's rung him up feeling out of it, so to speak. There was a tape recording of that actual conversation on the phone where you could hear Joe asking Lenny what was wrong, what was going on, and Lenny was telling him not to worry about it. Everything would be all right. He'd be right the next day. So people knew about this, and I think that was the essence of this case, why it brought out a lot to the public and why it continues to mystify people about this case, is because intelligent people from the university actually went along to a party not once but two to supposedly see a person commit suicide, which is a bit macabre in anybody's sense. But these people were going along to this party to see that. And I think that's one of the things that gets people in this case, that they don't understand how well-educated people could actually do that.
Why didn't they tell anyone? Why didn't they report it if they thought that something so tragic was going to take place?
There was one person who went to Anu Singh and told her that she was going to the police, and Anu Singh convinced her that it wasn't going to happen, that she wouldn't do anything. That person didn't go to the police at that stage. She did come along later on, and her name has been suppressed, of course. So she did tell several people what she was going to do. As I say, Madhavi Rao told the lady at the Health Commission what was going to happen. We had Anu Singh telling this lady what was going to happen. There was Lenny Mancini, who knew part of what was going to happen, and these people were put in this position. Whilst one lady had the fortitude to tell Anu that if she carried on with it, she would go to the police, and Anu promised that she wouldn't, so she didn't continue going to the police, but certainly other people knew what was going to happen.
Did Anu share with anyone she was speaking to what her motivation was, why she would want to do this to Joe?
Well, her talking to the people was that it was going to be a double suicide attempt, that they were both going to do it.
And why did she say they were going to do it? Was there a reason other than the mental health issues that we discussed earlier? Did she just say it was something they had discussed and chosen to do?
I believe that Anu Singh had made up that story to make it look like that there was going to be a double suicide, and in fact, she knew all along that she was going to not commit suicide herself. And that was proven in the end she didn't do it. That's my belief, and I think that was brought out in the court as well.
What happened at the second dinner party, so the following night? What did Anu do?
Well, again, these people turned up for the dinner again, and this is a thing that confuses people, why people would go a second night to a dinner party. And again, Madhavi Rao was the one who, invited the people to come to this party. So the second night she drugged Joe again with Rohypnol, which Madhavi had purchased. Then early on in the morning she injected him with the heroin when the people had left. And that was the time that Madhavi Rao left as well and told her that she didn't want to be part of it. So that's the only indication that Madhavi Rao had actually pulled away from this serious offence, this murder. Well, we would describe it as murder, but the court didn't find it that way.
What did Joe ultimately die of?
A massive heart attack brought about by the overdose of Rohypnol and heroin.
I suppose one of the most perplexing parts of this case is the emergency call that Anu made, because she intentionally made it difficult for people to know where she was or where Joe was. What did she say and how did she mislead paramedics that day?
I suspect she realised that Joe had either died or was in the last throes. She contacted the paramedics, the ambulance, through 000. She gave a false name and she gave a false address to where she was, and she kept asking the lady on the telephone, the ambulance officer who was answering the phone, what to do, as his lips had gone blue, I think it was, and that she pretended to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation with Joe. But when you listen to the tape, you can hear she's just blowing into the telephone virtually, puffing, I should say, rather than anything else.
How did she behave when they arrived? Did she appear distressed by the fact that her boyfriend was in that state?
When the uniformed police arrived, and they were obviously the first police to arrive there, after the ambulance, of course, had called them, she appeared distressed. She didn't want to be taken away from Joe's body. She kept telling them that she didn't mean that to happen. She did tell them that she injected him with the drug, with heroin. And, yeah, that was her demeanour for the rest of the night.
Did she tell police why she had done that?
Not at that stage, no.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with former Detective Superintendent Greg Rance, who was part of the investigation into Joe Cinque's death. In her 1999 trial, there were a few sort of issues with earlier trials, but what did her defence try to argue Was her mental health potentially a way to argue diminished responsibility?
So what she was saying was that she told the police and the ambulance that she gave Joe the heroin so he wouldn't interfere with her suicide attempt. So this is the story that she used at that time. So when we get to the trial, and there were technicalities through the judging, which is an interesting aspect of the case again, yes, they brought in diminished responsibilities. And obviously what the meaning of that is that at the time that she committed it, she didn't know what she was doing, mentally didn't know what she was doing. You know, with the evidence that was proffered before all that, going to the library, trying to find a gun, going and using the heroin, organising parties, Madhavi Rao telling a person that she was going to go to a party where the worst crime in the Crimes Act would be committed, because they were law students, so they knew what the worst act in the Crimes Act was, is murder. And so with all this information beforehand, the prosecution side of it found it a bit difficult to understand how they could bring in this mental incapacity at that stage of it all, because the preparation was all there. Was the intent there? Yeah, we believe so. They brought in diminished responsibilities, what they call a state of disassociation, from reality. That was the argument. So in the end, it was a technical argument between psychiatrists, and it was up to a judge alone. The judge believed that she was mentally incapable of committing the crime at that time.
With the interviews with police in the lead up to that trial, what did Anu say in terms of shedding light potentially on motivation? Did she stick to the story that she had been planning on taking her own life that night and therefore she needed him to not be conscious? Was that the story that she continued to tell?
No, the next story, of course, was the story of they were both going to commit suicide. So it was going to be a suicide pact. It's got to be noted that earlier on that she had gone to the library to study how to get off murder, and that was brought up at the trial as well. So, her thinking beforehand and her presentation after the crime were quite dichotic. They were quite different.
Did police find it difficult to believe that this was a state of dissociation or that she was mentally incapacitated, given how much planning had gone into it, given how much she knew? Did it look to police like this had been a decision she had made?
The development of the prosecution case obviously was the interviewing of a lot of witnesses, including those that turned up for the party, but certainly into finding the person who'd had given her the drugs, the heroin. We also interviewed the person who'd given Madhavi Rao the Rohypnol. We interviewed Madhavi Rao, who wasn't too forthcoming with it all, but it was obviously she was under the control of Anu Singh to a degree. All this had been taken into account, the interviewing of a lot of witnesses. As most people know, these sort of things aren't done overnight. So there was a lot of evidence to say that there was a lot of preparatory work in relation to these parties. So we were, I suppose, not surprised that the defence would bring forth mental issues, because that was really the only defence that was open to them. And it was successful on their part.
Were psychologists or psychiatrists able to diagnose Anu with anything specifically?
The prosecution psychiatrist, his feeling was that she was capable and understood what was going on at the time of the offence. The prosecution have to prove everything beyond reasonable doubt. So the defence only has to bring in that slight doubt into the offence, and they did that successfully by saying that they believe that she had a mental issue at the time of the offence itself. The judgment that was brought down, which surprised everybody, was that the Judge Crispin said that at the time that she injected the heroin, that she was mentally incapable of understanding the seriousness of what she was doing.
And so did that mean that it wasn't a murder charge but a manslaughter charge?
When we have a murder charge, the court has the option of preferring manslaughter as a secondary charge to it. That's exactly what they did.
And what was her sentence?
10 years she got sentenced with, minimum of 4 years non-parole.
What did Joe's family make of such a short sentence when their son had been killed?
Nino and Maria Cinque were the parents, and Anthony was the other son that they had. Anthony, as the son, was so distressed at the time that he wouldn't go to the trial that I had to actually go around with another police officer and talking him into coming into court. And ever since that day, he hasn't been the same at all. Maria was, and so was Nino, they were just totally distraught by the handing down of the verdict. And as the investigating police and the prosecution, all the evidence that was led before the court, we were too. And also, of course, the most strangest part about it all, I think on everybody's terms, was the judge dismissing any charge against Madhavi Rao whatsoever.
So Madhavi Rao was on trial for charges of murder and manslaughter, I think administering a stupefying drug. Was she just not found guilty of any of those things?
She was found not guilty of everything. This was something that changed the course of how courts are conducted in the ACT, because since that day there was legislation brought in that these sort of trials, murder trials, wouldn't be done by judge alone. The judge alone trials were predominantly brought in for serious fraud cases where you had to have speciality understanding of the offence itself. They were for cases that needed some particular expertise that the normal person on the street wouldn't understand. But when cases like this for murder, the strange thing that mystifies myself is that the Justice Crispin, he was the one who decided that they should be tried separately, but actually sat on both trials. So I can't understand how a person can sit on both trials and have a clear, I don't care how good you are, you can't disassociate yourself from the first trial. And when you're listening to the same evidence for the second trial, you can't disassociate yourself from any evidence you've heard before. That was a ludicrous thing. How Justice Crispin got away with it, I don't know, but that was the law at the time.
It's really difficult to understand, but in the years that have passed since, have you come to any sort of clarity as to why that was the judge's decision? Why, it was such a short sentence for Anu to begin with, but also to have Madhavi Rao not found guilty of any of those charges. Why do you think that was the decision?
Myself and others we still ponder that. I mean, there's been books and movies written about it. Helen Garner wrote a book about it and put her beliefs in there. And it's, look, I think that whole trial itself and the way it was conducted, well, it was a study by itself, why you would have judge splitting them up at that stage. And I can understand that sometimes you've got to split up co-conspirators, I suppose. Understanding, for those that don't, understanding that if two people go and work together to commit a crime, then they go past the conspiracy part and the crime's actually committed, then even if the other person isn't present, they can still be charged with the crime. The easy way to explain it, I suppose, it's a bit like the two people turning up for a bank robbery and one person stays in the car, the other person goes in with a gun and somebody gets shot and died. Well, the person in the car gets charged with the murder as well. And that's a simple explanation of it. How she walked away with it when she was the one who actually purchased the Rohypnol. She was the one who actually went out and organised the parties. She was actually there on the night of both times, and she was the one who told the lady in the Health Commission that the worst crime in the Crimes Act was going to be committed. How the judge alone found her not guilty is beyond my comprehension. The courts can find a person not guilty of something and the other person guilty of it, but this is sort of reversed, where Anu Singh was found guilty and Madhavi Rao was found not guilty. It's beyond my comprehension, and I'm sure it's beyond the comprehensions of many students of this case since then.
What has Anu's life been like since her release?
Obviously, she was taken back into custody when she broke her parole conditions and then re-released again. Studied law since, got degrees since, purports to be working for the issues of women in prison and all those sort of things. She's been in new relationships. So, look, the suffering of the Cinques, that will never, ever diminish over time. They lost 2 young men out of this, 2 sons, one to mental issues because of what happened to his brother and the death of the other one. So it's a tragedy in that respect. I think Anu was a highly intelligent person. No matter what she testified in the witness box, I do believe she knew what she was doing.
Has she expressed any remorse, either during the trial or since her release, towards what she did, but also to Joe Cinque's family?
Look, she tried to contact the Cinque family to talk to them, but obviously, and quite rightfully so, the Cinques didn't want anything to do with her. I don't think there would be anything that Anu could say that would recompense for the loss and the tragic loss of their son for no particular reason but her own feelings of ineptitude. She is a highly capable person. She's obviously highly intelligent. And I can only repeat that the lead up to the death of Joe was lined with issues of intent. So again, I can only say going to the library, studying all this stuff, studying how to get off a murder trial, studying the effects of drugs on people, going out, trying the heroin yourself, getting Madhavi Rao to organise parties, not 1 but 2 parties when the first one failed, trying the injection into him the first time where it jellied up. These sort of things were just complete intent, as far as I'm concerned, leading up to the death of Joe Cinque, no matter what the justice system said.
Well, that's the last thing I wanted to ask, was that in the years since, do you think there's been any clarity on why she killed Joe Cinque?
Look, it's my personal opinion. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I think she's just highly narcissistic, and people with narcissistic tendencies can commit crime. Narcissism doesn't necessarily mean you're unstable mentally. It's a form of what people are. There's lots of narcissistic people in the world. We all probably are in our own way. She took it to the heights, and my belief is that she was going to kill Joe no matter what, and it was all her self-indulgence and her narcissistic behaviour. And I think that was identified, or exemplified, I should say, with the way that she used Madhavi Rao. This was a complete sign to me of narcissistic behaviour.
Greg Rance worked for the Australian Federal Police for almost 30 years, investigating many cases, but none more perplexing than Anu Singh's. Currently, Greg works as Managing Director and Senior Instructor of Australian Forensic Services. He's also Vice President of Australian Federal Police Former Members Association. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you want to discuss today's episode, make sure you join our Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations and make a request to join. And to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamamia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as our new podcast Cancelled, all about who's in, who's out, and who cares in the world of celebrities.